Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains bizarre yet effective. And today, we're going to be talking about just that. Trains and locomotives that were weird. Legitimately bizarre. And yet, they totally worked, and worked well. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. These are 5 of the weirdest successful trains. Part 4. The NS Intercity Materieel. No, that's not misspelled. This is Dutch. Nederlandse Spoorwegen. And a special thank you to my Discord server for helping me put this list together, as I was a little busy this week and I didn't have time to read as much as I usually would, and I kind of needed some suggestions for some of my followers, and Lord knows the Dutch seized their opportunity. This is just one of 3 different Dutch trains on this list, but admittedly they did give me weird ones, so I'll give them a pass this time. I just enjoy the fact that all I said was, I need weird successful locomotives, and they responded with, did you mean Dutch? I don't know what I expected from them. The Intercity Materieel is an electric multiple unit, an EMU, that was operated by Nederlandse Spoorwegen in the Netherlands. Its nickname is Koplopper because it had a walking through head mechanic that I'll get to. You might think that relates to the position of the cab, which in part, but not exactly. These things are double-ended for one. And the cabs were put high for at least 2 reasons. One, that does give the driver a solid field of view. It looks bizarre, but they can sure see well out of them, so hey. But the real reason for the walking through head element is that these things were designed for multiple unit operation. You could combine multiple train sets together and have them work. But they were double-ended. How would you connect a cab to... Oh. Well, that's neat. Yeah, so there was a walkway built underneath where the cab was, and there were doors on the front of them that allowed them to connect to each other that way. It was an interesting setup, if not quite weird. 144 of these were built in total, and they've been in service since 1977. Yes, they are indeed still used. They were quite successful. However, their weirdest element, the walking through head thing, yeah, that is no longer used at all. In fact, they were permanently sealed shut in 2006 during a refurbishment, because they never really worked that well, if I'm being honest. Yeah, I'm kind of cheating here, because, overall they are a success, but their weirdest element wasn't. For one thing, they just didn't have to use them that often, but they also were prone to a lot of technical difficulties that actually made trains late on occasion, which was, well, annoying. They didn't want that to happen anymore, so they just said the heck with it and stopped using them entirely. Still, the train sets themselves are still in service now, and if you're ever in the Netherlands, you could, in fact, ride on them. Some of my Dutch rail fans who follow me probably have at some point. The NS Class 200. See, I told you the Dutch got a little carried away here. The Nederlandse Spoorwegen Class 200 is a group of diesel locomotives that were built between 1934 and 1951. A total of 169 were produced, and the last of them weren't retired until 2008, which is actually legitimately impressive. But to be fair, they were designed to be as simple as possible, tiny little diesel shunters built by Werksvoer. The railway staff called them Locomotives due to how small they were. But what's so weird about them? They look just like typical diesel shunters. Look closer. Look closer at the absolute nonsense on display. What is that? Are those controls? On the outside of the locomotive? Oh yes. They were meant specifically to be operated from the side, and they weren't even equipped with a dead man switch to stop the locomotive in case the operator, fell off in this element, which is probably infinitely more likely. There were 2 manual brakes, a handle and a foot brake. The handle was in fact so loose that it could be moved by in-train forces, so it was required to be fixed by a nut and a bolt. It was necessary to loosen this nut and bolt whenever you took them out. And in some cases that was forgotten entirely, and that meant that the operator couldn't brake. which caused them to run into things, often enough to be mildly irritating, but they did function very, very, very well, and were extremely cheap to operate. Some were even fitted with cranes, which also had to be operated from outside, though at least there they would be used whenever the locomotive was stopped, so I kind of get that. Like I said, they lasted until 2008, which is really impressive, and the reason they were pulled was, frankly, due to safety reasons. New Dutch personnel regulations involving keeping people from dying prevented Nederlandse Spoorwegen from using them any longer. If that hadn't been in place, they probably would have kept using them because they were just so easy to manage. They were as simple as can be, to the point of making them downright bizarre, but they functioned well. But sadly, they are no longer used. Though over half of them actually survive in preservation, around 89 or so. 80 of them wound up scrapped or lost during the Second World War, but the rest are still around because, well, they're tiny. They're easy to put in places and useful on heritage rail lines. We always love these tiny diesels, so hey, more power to them, I suppose. The Saxon III K, or just sometimes called the 3K, which I'm not going to do because of reasons. We're just going to call it the Saxon III. These were a group of 6 tank engines, 062Ts, that were originally built for the Royal Saxon State Railways. That's how far back these date. They were originally built in 1889. Royal Saxon State Railways were the state-owned railways operating in the Kingdom of Saxony. Later the company would be merged into the Deutsche Reichsbahn, Germany, and these locomotives were grouped into their DRG Class 99.754s. Whatever you want to call them, what is the deal with that? That has no business operating. I don't know what it is. I don't trust it, though. Look at it. It's very suspicious. But it worked. You're probably wondering what's going on with that. And, well, I'll answer this. These were very powerful tank engines for the time, and in that regard, they were extremely useful. They proved their worth, but their technology was inherently complicated, and that's why there were only ever 6. The boiler itself was a long boiler type that was made from 3 rings that had to be riveted together. They had 2 cylinders between the frames, with external Stephenson valve gears, which drove the middle coupled axle. The power transmission to the radially adjustable coupled axles was carried out using length-adjustable coupling rods of the close type. Radial adjustment of the first and third coupling axles and the control of the lever parallelogram on the coupling rods was carried out according to the swing-out radius of the articulated bunker, using a lever linkage. Now, why in the heck would you want to do any of that? Well, simply put, it helped them negotiate turns. The driving axles could change their distance to the middle axle to fit through tighter corners. In that way, it's almost an early method of articulation, however silly it may seem. But if it worked, it worked. And it did. They were quite successful. Just too complicated to reproduce is kind of what their case was. But they lasted until 1925. So that's about 35 years of actual service, which is not bad for such a really weird case such as this. The LTM-51. Yeah, see, I warned you there were 3 Dutch trains on here, and what are you doing to the Garratt? This is it is a Garratt, it is, but it's an inside cylinder Garratt? What? Why is this thing a thing? Well, the thought was that the Garratt design would be helpful for heavier freight trams on curved and steep sections of the line that they were meant to operate on. The 040s they had been using just weren't strong enough anymore, and thus the LTM-51 was meant for those heavy good trams. Trams. Yes, really, this is supposed to be a tram engine! This is the only Garratt design that anyone seems to be aware of that had an inside cylinder at all, and that was supposed to increase steady running at higher speeds and keep the gear away from dust and the general public. Again, it was a tram engine, so having outside cylinders was kind of dangerous. They didn't want to do side skirts or anything, so they just put the cylinder inside. which admittedly in this context does make sense. The water tanks were put below the footplate and outside of the frame, with the coal bunker being in a similar spot that a regular tank engine would have it, right behind where the cab was. This kept the gravity point low and achieved better load distribution over the axles, especially when water was running low itself, which, is bad, but this helped to mitigate that problem too. It also gave a better view for the driver in general. The outside bits of the Garratt design did not have the high tender element. They were flat. You could in fact walk on them. The driver could see very well, and for a tram setup, that was very important because there are many people around. This was meant to move heavy trains on tram lines. And it did. Really, I can't believe it either. Not only is this a weird example of a Garratt, but it's also the last Hanomag locomotive ever built, due to economic troubles the company was suffering at the time, and it actually carried 2 builders' numbers. Hanomag's business was transferred to Henschel, but the locomotive was actually built and completed. It entered service in 1931 and performed extremely well. It achieved a significant reduction of coal consumption and ran very steady even at high speeds. But the locomotive's life was quite short, only running for 7 years. Why? Well, that wasn't anything to do with it. It was fine. The line it was meant to run on was closed in 1938. With all other assets of the line, the Garratt was sold to Dortmund scrapyard. It was actually sold again in 1940 to a different Dutch company, and then again in 1941 to Germany, which is sinister at that time, and it disappeared after that. Likely scrapped to fuel the German war machine, if I had to guess. Frederick Lundström's final steam turbine locomotives. Steam turbine locomotives? Yeah, those are generally pretty weird in the grand scheme of things. You don't see them very often. But I'm sorry, these are supposed to be success stories. Locomotives that work. We've been over steam turbines before. They're just not efficient. You mean to tell me somebody got them to work? Yes, Frederick Lundström, a Swedish engineer, who had actually had a history trying to work out how to get steam turbines to actually, be functional and usable. He had quite a number of examples built, with mixed success. The big issue that he had is that he always wanted to introduce a condensing tender. That does grant higher efficiency by presenting the turbine exhaust with a partial vacuum. But the problem is that a condenser like that, especially back then, greatly added to the complications of the machinery itself. It drove maintenance costs through the roof because you needed specialists to work on it. People just didn't understand how it functioned. Why use something like this when a regular steam locomotive was doing just fine? Well, Lundström didn't want to give up, and in 1932, in conjunction with there are so many continents there. Sweden, why? N & Holm Company, we're gonna go with that. Lundström managed to develop a very successful 280 steam turbine locomotive that was actually based on an existing conventional design for freight traffic on the Grängesberg-Oxelösund Railway. The main purpose of that railway was the transportation of iron ore from mines around the area, a distance of 159 miles, 255 kilometers. Due to the distance and weight involved with these kind of trains, the turbines actually flourished in this very specific setting. They proved to be more efficient than their conventional counterparts. They could pull 1,830 tons of a 1 in 100 gradient, and they saved about 10% on fuel. Lundström had learned from his previous mistakes and did not give these engines a condenser, which, while technically would have made them more efficient in terms of operation, it would not have in terms of maintenance, so he didn't even bother with it. It just had a forward-mounted turbine and a jackshaft drive. William Stanier actually visited to take a look at the locomotive, and it became the inspiration for the LMS turbomotive, but that's another story. 2 further examples of the locomotive were built. The class was known as M3T. And despite being built in the early 30s and most turbines not lasting past 10 years, these locomotives lasted until the mid-50s, when the lines they were on were electrified. All 3 of them wound up in preservation at the Railway Museum at Grängesberg. Their numbers are 71, 72, and 73, and stand as such a unique case. Steam turbines for the most part, don't usually work out that well historically. They just don't for a variety of reasons. Their efficiency is questionable, especially at low speeds. But due to the purpose that these locomotives were given, and the lines they ran on, and the weight of the trains involved, they absolutely flourished in their setting. So hey, props to Sweden for making steam turbines actually efficient. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders. Sumdu 267 Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Number for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Row Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Racer 78, Crystal Morgan, Ohio Trucker 1, Lord Hoth 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, NG5, Mark Holding, and Mercenary Revy. Till next time, this is Darkness, Individual Fond, farewell.